This is a clip from the Cannon podcast. To hear the full episode and get access to exclusive benefits, head over to patreon.com/thecannonpod and sign up for just £3 a month. Let's move on to Aaron Ramsdale. Was possibly not his best game, let's say. Let's put it that way against Manchester United.
It just wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't a good game against Manchester United. Obviously, there was the mistake for the goal. I think he could possibly do better on actually even the second one. I would say my understanding of football, I'm sure people in the comments would say, is zero. If my understanding of football is zero, my understanding of goalkeeping is -1. So I wouldn't like to necessarily comment on his sort of goalkeeping technical qualities. But when I'm looking at that moment from the Bruno Fernandes thing, I don't think he adjusts his feet properly. I just think it's a poor bit of goalkeeping. And then the one thing I've always said with Ramsdale is his kicking has kind of made up for it. You know, in his first season, I think he was in those kind of Alisson conversations, not just sort of colloquially and in online fan debate. I mean, statistically, John Harrison of goalkeeper.com, I think it is, does some great analysis on this. And he talks about, he went on a breakdown with Latte Firm, and he talks about this, and he said, Ramsdale is in those echelons for shot stopping and in those conversations and that sort of stuff. And I've seen recently, his data, I've heard other bits of data suggesting that he's sort of kind of slipping down that pecking order. Are we worried about Ramsdale? Because I said this to someone the other day. I'm not worried about him at the moment, right? But if I had to write a list of players that I think I could be worried about in 3 months' time, because that's how my anxious brain works. Let me think about things that I might be anxious about in 3 months' time.
Because you ran out of the list of what you are anxious about. We've got to go down.
I'm not anxious right now, so I should think about things I could be anxious about. That'll be good. That'll help me. But seriously, if we wrote a list, I think we could have a conversation about certain players, like possibly Kai Havertz. Lots of question marks is what I'm saying. And someone like Aaron Ramsdale would also place on that list and say, can I see myself having question marks about him in 3 months' time if things aren't sort of slightly picking up? Yes. That is all with a caveat. He's still an extremely young man in terms of goalkeeping years, like dog years. He is also someone who I feel really benefits from the rhythm of competition. I think he's someone who really benefits from playing every couple of days, just keep going, because I think that keeps him in a competitive, concentrated mindset. And I don't want to get into any speculation about his mental state, which I think is frankly disrespectful. But I think there is a conversation to be had about Ramsdale really loving away days. He gave an interview with TNT Sports where he said something along the lines of like, what are you looking forward to about the Champions League? And he said, whatever he said. And they said, what stadiums? Didn't say the Bernabeu, didn't say the Allianz, didn't say Camp Nou. He said those little ones where there's hostile environments. And you can see his eyes light up. He is someone who loves that. But we ended up conceding more at home last season than we did away. And I'd love to see something change about his concentration in home games that can match his fire in away games. So yeah, there are some concerns for me.
Well, I think you have to build out that mentality. Look, for better or for worse, by the way, because I think there's pros and cons to both mentalities. But you've got to talk about the mentality of a keeper. And why I'm doing this is because I think goalkeepers, more than any position on the pitch, psychological edge is probably the most important thing, because you're doing nothing for 90% of the time, right? And you've got two, almost in a coaching sense, you kind of profile the calm, the uber calm, composed keeper, and you profile the other one who's the amped up keeper. And there's two ways, right? Pros and cons both ways. Obviously, somebody that's super laid back tends itself to tense situations, but sometimes can have a lackadaisical attitude. Then there's somebody that's constantly on. That means that maybe sometimes it's really good in high performance atmosphere conditions because they're up for it. But then sometimes that leads to overindulgence, over arrogance, and whatnot. The one thing that I think with Aaron, and for better for worse, is I think he has to believe that he's worth his time in a sense. And there are times that, by the way, he will play himself into a game. What do I mean by that? He will make saves harder, in a sense, to kind of get himself involved. He will do things, by the way, the things that he does to rile up the crowd, that is to get him to a point where he is in the game. Like, he actively understands that his mind wanders. And there was actually a brilliant podcast, I think it was with the BTB podcast, where he kind of talked about this idea about him having to have a game within a game. And there's a lot of players that do this, by the way, but especially with goalkeepers, because there's such a mental tax on your ability to keep focused for 90 minutes and plus, right? The only reason I'm talking about this is because when I talk about preseason, there's no stakes. There's no stakes in preseason. So this entire idea about amping himself, Ramsdale, for me, we're never going to see a preseason, in my opinion, that he's going to be not stellar, lights out. I just have this theory. When the season comes, ironically, I have zero qualms because I feel that he understands stakes at that point, and he actually thrives in it. I worry more for Aaron Ramsdale against Nottingham Forest than I do Chelsea away, Chelsea at home. And look, that's not good. I'm not saying that's good, by the way. It's something that he has to improve and he has to work on. But I do think a lot of the issues that people had with his distribution were just wrong, flat out wrong. We've seen Aaron Ramsdale and his skill. It's instruction, by the way. There might be a better conversation that we can poke a little bit, and I can maybe turn it back to you. I noticed that we're a lot more direct in our build-up throughout this preseason, and I think it's in order to compete for second balls. And I've drawn a lot of basketball analogies because, look, the squad and even Mikel have referenced it quite a bit. But in basketball, one of the best things that you can do is essentially on a turnover is to press high up the court and to transition quickly. I'm seeing that quite a bit with our goalkeeping. And look, Aaron Ramsdale can slip in balls into the center backs and into Declan Rice, no problem. We've seen that. And this idea that he's abandoned this to go long, and that's him being afraid, quote and end quotes, is ridiculous to me. That's a coaching instruction.
Yep.
So let's make sure that we're critiquing the right aspect of the goalkeeping, in my opinion. And I wanted to hear your thoughts. Like, do you believe that there's a certain transition focus that we're hoping maybe to compete for second balls in the middle third versus our own third? And I think that's the transition we need to look at.
Well, what I see is a quote from Mikel saying, we can use Havertz as a reference point to go long. Yep. He literally said that himself. So that is clearly part of the plan, and I completely agree with you that this idea that Ramsdale's just hoofing it long because he's scared of playing it short is rubbish.
Yeah.
What I do have concerns about is, the rhythm of competition that I spoke about, and I think there is a growth potential there. He's got to find a way of getting himself up for, as you mentioned, Nottingham Forest. He's just got to find a way of doing that. I don't know how he does that. And he almost has the opposite problem to a lot of players who kind of seem to crumble. And I actually think Ramsdale will do really well in the Champions League. I think he'll be that sort of player who he'll be pulling out saves left, right, and centre. He'll be screaming, kissing the badge. People will love that. But he's got to find a different way of doing that. My issue has been execution at times. I think there has been a drop off in the kind of what I would call Hollywood balls into the centre of the park. There's sort of like low fizzed balls into Erdegaard that we were seeing in sort of 2021, 22. Or
even to Oba.
Yes, exactly. So we I think we've seen that, and we've seen a different style. Again, I would believe that is instruction. But I've seen, and it's something actually Rohan picked up on, I've seen when you press him from
the right
towards his right foot, I think he can be pressed out of the game and panic and execute things incorrectly. When he's kicking across himself, I think he's doing all right, and I think he's fine. And those chip balls out to the far-hand side are still there. I think we're seeing a different style, but again, I completely agree that I believe that's instruction. But just anecdotally, and I'd have to look at the evidence and the data for that to completely back this up, anecdotally, I feel Ramsdale has lost something slightly in his execution of those balls.
I think it's because we don't ask him to do it as often. If you don't do a skill, you're not going to be able to practice it enough, right?
Possibly, yeah.
The one thing is I also look at the ball striking techniques. Maybe this is super technical for people, but just as a coach, when you're striking...
I know nothing about goalkeeping, so if you can teach me anything...
Well, just like when you open up, right, with those low-driven balls, the technique is a little bit more chipped and lofted to your strong foot. Whenever you go across, you naturally strike through the ball. It's a lot easier to coach that because you're naturally having to go to that direction, right? Now, if you're on the strong foot, you're going to be opening yourself up, and it's a little bit less of maybe that driven through ball, but a lot more players prefer that kind of curved finesse chip out, and that is less accurate. It's lofted. It's it's slower, and it hangs up a bit more in terms of just technique, and so it's naturally a lot harder to strike through the ball but maintain your momentum in the same direction. When you're striking through the ball to carry yourself across your body, you're just naturally striking through the center of the ball. And so that's why it's maybe a little bit easier just naturally to see that pattern. The one thing I'll just say is I do think that Aaron Ramsdale's lack of consistency in those aspects right now may have to do a bit more with who is in the right space as opposed to his technique. And what I mean by that, Bukayo Saka is a little bit more ball to feet than Martinelli. When you're striking through, a lot of your phases are setting Martinelli through on goal, whereas Bukayo Saka is the first to receive in that space to knock it to a Ben White. And we play short more often, so there's less of a need to do a driven ball wide and high because Saka isn't going to take on his 1v1. Now, by the way, I don't like that, but it's just naturally what we use our different left and right-hand sides to do. We play short on the right, and we play long on the left, typically. We even saw that last year. And I don't love it, but it's kind of a pattern I'm noticing. And I wonder if we can vary it up.
And I wonder if it's fair to say with that, if you're playing short on the right and long on the left, if we're using that idea, on the left, it's not to say you don't have to be accurate, but the idea of putting it on a postage stamp or or dropping it on someone's foot is less necessary than on the right-hand side. So you're kind of fizzing it into a space for someone to run onto, which you need to worry perhaps more about the weight of the ball at that point, which is probably a little bit easier to control. Whereas you're actually controlling on the right hand side, literally where that ball's going to land, and that's probably a little bit harder.
And it plays into your mental aspect, right? Because then you change your technique, right? So again, when you're hitting into space, you don't have to drop it on a 10 pence, I guess is the term. Whereas when you're playing short, you must. Otherwise, you're going to lose possession. And by the way, by playing short, you're also shortening the distance to goal for your opposition. So, nothing to be concerned about, I would say. But I do agree that he's got to tighten up those things, right? Like, I mean, ultimately, when we're talking about Aaron Ramsdale, I want to talk about him as the best goalkeeper in the league. And those are the standards that you have to beat with Alisson, by the way. And we're not talking...
These are the fucking standards.
Those are the standards, right?
These are the standards.
I think that's something that he could improve on, like you said.
Yeah, I think execution and rhythm.
Thanks for checking out the Cannon Podcast. To get full episodes and access to exclusive benefits, head over to patreon.com/thecannonpod and sign up for just £3 a month.